Okay, this is class number 21. And we've gone through the whole Enlightenment, and we ended with Karl Marx, um, with his view of communist takeover. So communism or Marxism was a particular political movement it, in Europe in the 1848, where the recommendation was that the proletariat, the workers, take over the private sector economy. But in the history of America, the word socialism was became popular long before the Marxist revolutions. So it did not mean people did not associate it with Marxism or communism. They never heard of it, right? So we have to get that straight. So far, I have talked about toxic culture. After Marx, we talked about Mate, talking about our toxic culture, and he attributes a lot of toxicity to capitalism, to the whole culture, the way we think, the way we act, our institutions are set up, is all um, controlled by these large corporations. And it's important that you get in your mind what we have now is nothing at all like what America had. And it changed over time radically. It completely morphed from what the free market or private enterprise, the way that that worked in relationship to government, and the way that many of our leaders in the past were self-described Christian socialists. Because Jesus, for example, after he died, the early church was socialist, literally. They shared their property. And there are 3,000 quotes in the Bible against greed, against excess wealth. Aristotle said, greed is the ultimate political vice because it will destroy societies. So that's what we're doing. It's just that people keep referring back to the split between either socialism or capitalism, and that is completely distorted. The kind of free market we have now has never existed before. I don't know, in human history, or certainly not since the industrial era, or since the social Darwinism way back, but something that history corrected for example, when the Victorian era, when the first wave of industrialization led to a huge gap between the rich and the poor, the utilitarians came in and they made all sorts of recommendations for how to redistribute, how either the obligation of the nobility or some sort of tax structure to create some kind of middle class or to prevent people from starving on the street because capitalism alone was going to lead to disaster. John Locke did not want the system we have. Adam Smith did not want the system we have. And then you will see that even more recent writers who are associated with capitalism or a free market did not want what we have right now. So it's important that you get that straight because Americans are being indoctrinated to have this dichotomy between capitalism and socialism, and what the actual factual facts on the grounds are about the kind of regulated capitalism, the kind of balance between government funded services and private sector services, and also public-private uh, cooperation, what that really needs to head toward in a systems view, and the false dichotomy we have right now. China has changed its system radically, And so they allowed in private capital and they do a lot. You know, there are a lot of capitalist entrepreneurs in China or working for China. The Chinese government gives companies a lot of funding to innovate in green energy and other products. We have a major uh, person in the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan. He thinks we ought to imitate China, that our government should give money for green energy innovation also. The Inflation Reduction uh, Bill and the Build Back Better bills do provide for green energy infrastructure and other projects. So the government is paying for these projects, but we could go a lot further in government providing research and development money so we can innovate. So the government fosters innovation rather than just pays for the kind of solar or wind that we already have, because we need constant innovation in order to keep up. And I do have one article from the news about lithium and where there's a constant improvement of lithium batteries. So the research and development for these constant improvements, now it's going to be innovative products and then improvement of innovative products. All of that requires substantial funding. And where's it going to come from? So right now, China does a lot more of that than the US does. I'm not sure about India. I'm not sure about Saudi Arabia, but it's just an exciting time to rethink things. So all I'm asking my students to do is get out of the old paradigm and think more in terms of systems, think more in terms of the green energy transition and the kind of relationship between government and the private sector that we need to create, or at least in my students' minds, whatever other field you go into, don't get stuck in that old false dichotomy and those old, completely dated associations between the private sector and the public sector. So these three articles do give you a really good idea of what actually went on in history, and then how a certain kind of propaganda developed, funded by the corporations. And I think a lot of my students or a lot of Americans think this way. And there's no reason to think this way because it was created by the rich corporate um, propaganda structure that that created it for its own benefit, not for the benefit of people. All right. So here are the three chapters. Here are my outlines from these three chapters. So it's a book. Historians take on the biggest legends and lies about our past. I would recommend the book. I mean, American exceptionalism, there's just a whole lot of stuff that you might not even think about, the fact that you've sort of been indoctrinated into associating. You know, you've heard this expression, you think it's about this, you read this article and you go, oh my gosh, yeah. I've been brainwashed, so let me try that again. It's just this constant self-examination process. Okay. So in 1825, okay, this is 25 years before the Marxist manifesto. Okay, this is long before the associations that we have with, socialism. It's not, there was no Karl Marx or communism or anything that Americans knew about. Maybe I'm sure he was trying to organize something, but it hadn't happened yet. So 1825, this is a wealthy man in Wales. He comes to the US and he explains that we have an urgent need to establish a new system of society. One would be based on principles of strict justice and impartial kindness, because he knew that the Adam Smith free market, that it had taken shape in a way that was not what Adam Smith intended. There's not beneficence. Adam Smith wanted the privileged class to be educated for virtue, which included generosity. It's not happening. And so he's really concerned. I would imagine that he might have lost hope, or he thinks Europe is way more entrenched. So he comes to the US and say, hey, you guys, you could do better. Like, don't make the mistakes in Europe, or you're the progressive country. You want a middle class. That's why people come here for opportunity, social mobility. So I'm telling you, you've got to modify the free market if you want social mobility. Okay. He condemned the reigning economic order, which he called the trading system. So that is the free market. That's Adam Smith versus mercantilism, um, as selfish and inhumane at its core. It trained people to obtain advantages over others, strictly competitive, money sticks to money, and it gave a very serious, injurious surplus of wealth and power to the few, while exacting poverty and subjection on the many. So I hope you understand this, that this was in the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. The Enlightenment thinkers gave us the impression we're going to have this utopia, and it's not working. And so leaders who actually are concerned, the people with practical wisdom, the phronemos, according to Aristotle, is worried about this because he is wealthy. He has a voice, right? I know how this system works, and I can get richer and richer and watch people get poorer and poorer, but we have to structure a new system, right? It's not just me personally that's going to solve the problem. We need a new system. And I'm speaking from the point of view of a privileged person, because I see my self-interest is not in getting richer and richer. I've identified myself with the flourishing of the society. And in order to have a strong and stable middle class, we have to have a different structuring of our economic system, our political system, and the relationship between the two. Now, the legislators in the US Congress, right? The House and the Senate and the Supreme Court justices, they all listened to him. They were, they're all ears, because again, that was what they left in Europe. They left this class structure, and he's telling them it's going right back into the class structure. Like, scientific revolution, industrial revolution hasn't made any difference. We're right back where we were in terms of rich versus poor. He called the new system socialism. So that caught on around the world. Now in England, utilitarian, it was a movement that did create some sort of middle class to prevent them from having a Marxist revolution. The Marxist revolutions occurred in the least developed countries, okay, Russia and China. And so the cause obviously wasn't the Industrial Revolution. The cause was just this huge gap between the rich and the poor. And both Stalin and Mao sort of brought their countries from a feudal system, agricultural system, into an industrial system. Um, in a lot of ways, with a whole lot of deaths and destruction. But there was a movement at that time toward trying to industrialize, and then the industrial countries trying to socialize so that you could have a middle class. Um, and the author says, ever since then, or probably even before, but socialist movements have been a part of mainstream American history. It's our era is unique in the absence of socialist movements. Most have been committed to democracy, both as an electoral system and as the vision of a future where ordinary people in all their diversity would make the key decisions in their workplaces and communities. It wouldn't be controlled by rich corporations or the politicians who are basically the employees of the rich. Um, even for, okay, but today, conservative politicians and commentators, socialism has meant only a hankering for state tyranny and brazen assaults on property rights. Remember John Locke? I have a right to the fruit of my labor. Socialists are the sworn enemies of freedom and democracy. This is not the way it has been. It's a whole false narrative about the way our country's been and the way you achieve human flourishing. You know, societies like Aristotle said that are stable have a large middle class. Especially if you don't want authoritarianism. If you don't want forced stability, you have to have a society that has a balance between politics and economics and upward mobility and people have to be given, most people have to be given healthcare, education, a lot of goods and services that everybody needs and that need to be publicly funded because the middle and lower class will not be able to afford it out of their wages, okay? It used to be conservatives supported an environmental protection agency, preschool, much less public school, preschool, others, actually Nixon people, Republicans supported national health care. All socialists early on were devout Christians. They used to set up utopian little socialist Christian utopian communities. I went to a college that was founded by one of these Christian, well, it wasn't, yeah, it was Christian socialist communities. Socialists played a major role in getting women the right to vote. Anybody who thinks women should vote, right, should be grateful to the socialists. Social Security, Medicare, the minimum wage, workplace safety laws, women the right to work, I'm sure, universal health insurance, civil rights for all races and genders, right? Women's right to work, and the right not to be discriminated against, right? You have a right, and you also have a right not to be discriminated against. These were all socialists that you have to thank for the fact that you have these programs. Americans overwhelmingly favor curbs on the power of big business that conservatives since the 19th century, okay, since the 1800s, conservatives have condemned these as socialist. Well, Americans still favor this. Here's what they favor. The super rich should pay higher taxes than the middle class. Businesses should follow rules and act responsibly, which means the cabinet, which is made up of bureaucracies that enforce the rules that the Congress passes. So if Congress passes environmental laws, there's an environmental protection agency to enforce the laws. But if a conservative puts a person in charge of that agency who does not believe in these laws, they do not allow anybody who works there to go out and enforce them. So that's happening quite a bit. That happened way back. Ronald Reagan put James Watt on the EPA, and then many others since then. Ever since then, the Republican Party's Environmental Protection Agency director has been against environmental laws, except H.W. Bush. But this goes back to 1980 with a 4-year exception for the Republican Party, not the Democrats. They want enforcement of those laws. There's no predatory lending. Well, that's what happened in 2008. The collapse was because there weren't any regulations on these credit default swaps, and it was predatory lending. And the government wasn't powerful enough, and the Congress didn't catch it and figure out what's going on. And the person at the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, when the housing prices went way up, he didn't increase interest rates because he trusted businesses would take care of it as a matter of their own um, profit. Yeah, and that's stupid. Like, you shouldn't trust the business sector to curb its greed by choice. That's not the way the business sector now works. Um, Energy corporations should not endanger the planet and public health. Americans agree with that, yet they still will vote for somebody who puts somebody in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency that's going to block every environmental law. They should, Americans believe that consumer products should be safe. There was a time, and I don't know, 1900? Yeah, 1900, before the Great Depression, when there were minimal laws, where the philosophy was buyer beware. Okay, there weren't regulations on business. If you bought something that poisoned you, well, that was your problem. You didn't do the research. Or one example of what really got people motivated to have environmental protections was there were the little jumpsuits for babies, and it turns out they were made out of a highly flammable material. And yeah, I think that company either got sued or that was the beginning of having businesses accountable. You need a law so that this doesn't happen again. So a lot of those laws occurred, they exist because we didn't have it and some disaster happened. The Food and Drug Administration, Sinclair Lewis wrote The Jungle about how horrible the canning factories that had maggots in the food and all sorts of stuff. And it was because of that investigative reporting that we set up a Food and Drug Administration. So that's one of the older um, bureaucracies, older cabinet organizations. So we started setting up laws about safe food, safe conditions for processing food. All right. So, but it isn't just and Americans want decent wages and safe workplaces. So Americans want these things, but then the politicians they vote for do not provide them. And they have to figure out, do the politicians say that they will and then they just don't? Is there a political party that doesn't even pretend to care about that? Because they just don't talk about it. They'll talk about something else and distract the public. So that's up to you to figure out. The author of the Pledge of Allegiance was actually a Christian socialist. Um, but, and this is again very Aristotelian, a socialist economy has to be accompanied by an educational system that orients students towards social goals. That's what Adam Smith thought, that students have to be educated to care about the common good, to care about a strong and stable middle class. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't only demonstrate for civil rights, he also demonstrated for Poor People's March, for the need to have better distribution of wealth, need for a decent job, and to end poverty. Why did socialist candidates not win elections? Partly because the established parties became more socialists to avoid revolutions, but that hasn't been happening lately at all. This was earlier 20th century. The Democrat praised public ownership of utilities and railroads. The German socialists educated the workers to a high standard of political intelligence, independence, and of their social mission. So that's what, again, the system was trying to educate citizens so they would think like citizens, so they would have political intelligence. And our founding fathers also wanted a system of public education that included educating people for political intelligence. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican, and he promoted corporate regulation and craft unions, so the workers would unionize. Um, Okay, and he was unpopular among Republicans, but he was a champion of the workers. Woodrow Wilson wanted a national government must be more extended to facilitate public life. He was against monopolies. He made an alliance with organized labor. During the Depression, the New Deal, this was after our free market system collapsed. All right, what happened during the New Deal? He made some rules. You cannot fire workers who are trying to form a union. The artists created murals celebrating workers, and we started Social Security 1935. And that was condemned as socialism. And Republicans today, Project 2025, that's among the programs that they either want to cut or cut back on. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, um, national health care, all of those programs are being looked at. They're considered adversarial. They're considered anti-capitalist. So conservatives have always condemned such programs. Ronald Reagan started it. Before he went into politics, he was a corporate spokesman. He said, behind Medicare, right? If we allow Medicare, and he has this wonderful suave voice, uh, will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it. One day we will awaken to find that we have socialism. So it's called a slippery slope argument. Oh, if we give people health care, national health care, oh my God, then we're going to have this and that, and then we'll end up with Russia. So the word socialism now it's associated with Russia, obviously, because now we have the Marxist revolutions. That was not where that word got started. And socialism did not mean the kind of authoritarian government that Stalin had. And even Trotsky and Karl Marx knew that Stalin was not what they were thinking of. Okay? So it's just incredible how here's the reality, here's the facts, and here's the words, the labels that get put on it. So again, you have to be really careful because if you use Facebook, social media, you're taught that here's somebody's label, somebody's brand, what's actually going on in their life, right? So you're getting detached into a world of virtual reality. So you really have to understand what the real story is as opposed to the virtual story, the fake story. Um, so Ronald Reagan labeled John Kennedy's program as the old Karl Marx, right? Socialism is now absolutely Karl Marx, which it is not, and it never was. Reagan kept Medicare intact, however, because it was popular. He couldn't get reelected. It was also expensive. So right now we have a lot of programs that are popular and they're expensive, but people don't want to pay taxes. Or the Republicans will cut taxes, but most of that is for the rich and then blow up the deficit. Okay, so the Democratic Socialists want more programs and they want progressive taxation, which you tax wealth You don't just tax income, you tax um, capital gains tax, you value added tax, you tax people who have more wealth because, first of all, how do they get their wealth? At some point, workers created some kind of product that they made money on. Now, and then they can just money sticks to money. They can get wealth just by investing in the stock market. They don't have to create products anymore. And they can pass it on to their children and grandchildren. So their children and grandchildren have no idea where the money came from, but they inherited it. They deserve it. This is not what not what our founders wanted, or Adam Smith, or anybody. So what do the Democrats want? Healthcare for all, affordable housing, decent employment, high quality public education, and they claim that poverty is caused by institutions and public policies, not by individual laziness or corruption. The people who work the hardest and the most hours get paid the least, and people who have the most don't work for it because so much of it is just not earned. It's just money sticking to money. Since the Great Recession, there was a revival of socialism. But this book was written um, a while ago, not long time ago, but since then, so the last, what, 15 years has been some more disruptions and some more disagreements about how to get an economic system to work. Every time there's a disruption, the rich end up richer. Um, Okay, so by 2021, most people had a positive idea of socialism, and then also we need to switch to renewable energy. So the question is, how can the private sector make money on renewable energy? Well, to what extent should we have socialism? Should we have our government providing funding for research and development? Okay, the next article was the magic of the marketplace. So Ronald Reagan used to talk about that too. Just let the market decide. And I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but the market will take care of it. Well, what doesn't the market take care of? Climate change, because it doesn't consider that. When you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, the way John Locke describes it, you don't consider the cost of your producing your product. You don't consider the air pollution, the water pollution, the toxic waste, the all the toxic dump, the materials that get used and thrown out, the non-recyclable products related to the creation of your factory, the operation of your factory. None of this stuff is included at all. And so you can talk about an exploding GDP in the US without even mentioning environmental destruction. Or part of the GDP is this great new product of a gas mask because air pollution is so bad. Right? You could sell another product, so poison the air and sell a gas mask, or it's just the economy doesn't function that way. It just completely disregards the natural environment. We have to rethink that. The opioid crisis, how did that happen? I mentioned that before, that the neuroscientists who developed these drugs thought they would save the world because they just didn't understand human nature. They didn't understand the way economies work. They didn't understand the danger of the profit motive when you've got a product that makes people addicted, and how easily that can, morph into an underground of selling these products. The lack of affordable housing, this is partly because wealthy people do not want lower income housing in their area. And so people with lower incomes are forced into ghettos, but also there just isn't a lot of affordable housing. So there's rental properties that are in areas where everybody is below average income. There's a separation again between the rich and the poor because the rich can control the zoning so that you can't zone an area for multiple multiple for apartment complexes. Once again, the rich have control of the political system, the legal system. Obesity, and we've talked about that because you can sell people whatever they want. They want sugar, then you get all these problems. Gun violence, another problem that people would like some regulations on guns, but the gun lobby pays for political campaigns and insists on no regulations or absolute way less than the American public wants. And the money that the laws are made according to the money. Diseases from toxic chemicals. Um, it's hard to prove that this one toxic chemical causes cancer, right? Because it's really systems. It's how all the toxic, the poisons that you're exposed to in and out, day in and day out, together cause cancer. So no company can be liable because it's too hard to separate that your particular product caused it. But then people just keep getting cancer and nobody's accountable for it. The response to COVID was a market failure. You can't wait for somebody to make money. You have to have the government coming in there, providing money to create all the products needed to deal with COVID, the vaccines, but also the masks and all the other paraphernalia. Tobacco use, the market doesn't, um, the market profits from people getting addicted to things. Air pollution, that's not considered part of the cost and has to be included in what the company pays to put on extra, well, um, what was it, to prevent your company from polluting the air. Okay. It could be addressed. These problems could be addressed by appropriate government regulation and reshaping the markets. But the conservatives still insist government's the problem, and we need to believe in the magic of the marketplace. It's a very blind faith, and it's getting more and more obvious that it doesn't work. This is not what Adam Smith wanted. He recognized the need for taxation and for government to provide for the public good and regulation in cases where self-interest did not serve the greater good. And there's lots of cases where that's true. There was a decade-long propaganda campaign to get Americans to believe markets solve social problems. They don't. The belief, also, this is the other one that you have to get in mind, that the belief that political, civic, and economic freedom all go together. You get all of them or none of them. This is not so. American governments have always been involved in managing the economic life of the nation. Economic freedom does not guarantee political freedom, right? You can have an economic freedom and political authoritarianism, and you can have social democracy, right? You can have socialism and a democratic government. That's what they have in Europe, especially Northern Europe. But since 1895, now this is after the Communist Revolution, the National Association of Manufacturers were fighting against business regulations because now they can use communism, Marxism, right, as their backdrop, right? That was not the roots of socialism. That was not the way it's uh, dealt with in Europe, but the propaganda worked in a way that it just not with our founding fathers. Um, the goal was to convince the American public that their interests and those of the nation's um, corporations were virtually indistinguishable. So if you remember the chapter on the illusion of happiness, the American Psychological Association created all that positive psychology where you actually condition workers to believe that it's in their interest that the greater wealth of the company they work for is their greatest good, right? It's in their interest to care about the corporation's interest. So people were being indoctrinated with that at work through the trained psychologists or trained in behavior modification, and then they're indoctrinated in the newspapers and in political life by politicians. So, the president of Sun Oil, I am an ardent supporter of freedom and all that it comprehends: religious freedom, political freedom, industrial freedom, freedom of speech, the press and the assembly, and freedom of choice, which is maybe the most important of them all. I also believe freedom is indivisible. When a part is taken away, that which remains is no longer freedom. This is a complete lie, right? Um, Industrial freedom has only led to the rich versus the poor, and the poor lose political freedom because the industrial giants basically pay for the political campaigns. It's limited freedom of speech. When I did the lecture on Adam Smith and John Locke, I said it was the Achilles heel of the free market that that showed that if the rich get richer, you're going to lose freedom of speech because you can't pay for the newspapers that get all over. Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, he makes a ton of money. And people just choose to go to his site. There's lots of other choices. So why does he? Because he's done a whole lot of research on how to go to the brainstem and appeal to fantasies and phobias and get people to agree with Trump. That's how he makes his money, is to be on the side of Trump. At first, when Trump was a political candidate, Rupert Murdoch did not want him. But now that he can make money on him, yeah, he does want him. So the rich can control the media, they can control um, anyway, you lose freedom of choice, right? You can't choose to have a decent wage. You can't choose to have safe conditions at work. You can't choose to not be harassed, sexually harassed at work, unless the government comes in. So, but in the mind of these CEOs, they're all together. It's either all or nothing. It's called the tripod of freedom. Free press, speech, religion, cultural, representative government. You vote for your representatives who create the laws, but the corporations pay for the campaigns, and free enterprise. They claimed that the founding fathers valorized economic freedom, which they did not. It's false. The corporations were original products of the state. The state governments used the right to charter corporations as a way to influence and even control the private sector. So, yeah, there were no corporations apart from created by the state and regulated by the state, right? Which would sound like socialism to us today. But that's all there was at the beginning. The government controlled transportation, the government slavery, the expropriation of Native American lands, and trade tariffs were all government molded economy, right? The government allowed Southerners to have slaves. They would never have been able to have a slavery system unless the government approved of it. There was the government set up homesteads and made them legitimate, gave the Europeans property rights, and then would protect them from Native Americans fighting back. So they'd have the government militia protecting them, and then trade tariffs protected them from exports, imports from other countries. So the idea that the government is not involved in the private sector is ridiculous. It never was true. And it still is not true. But the corporations are now centralizing power in a way that's unlike ever before. Free enterprise does not exist in the Bill of Rights. It was only in 1919, which is right before the Great Depression, right, that the system of free enterprise was sort of institutionalized, and a very few years later, it collapsed, right? Because too much freedom for the corporations, too little regulation. Rich businessmen, they keep coming back. They will not admit this isn't working. They're just determined. The only solution is to cut taxes more for corporations, to have more corporate innovation. And that's Peter Thiel's view. And that's Elon Musk's view. Just give the entrepreneurs more money, more power, and we can solve problems. Has always been going on. They championed intellectuals. Certain intellectuals said, I agree with this. They gave them powerful academic positions to defend the free market. So Ludwig von Mises was a free market absolutist. He also sympathized with Austrian fascism, all right? And Andrew Mellon, another very rich robber baron in the US, he sympathized with Mussolini. Okay? I mean, so it's simply not the case that free enterprise goes with democracy. Free enterprise often goes with authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism. He opposed child labor laws. He doubted the virtue of public education. This is not like our founders. Our founders insisted on public education. But you take this intellectual who says all this stuff, rich businessmen promoted his career. Now, did he say that just because he knew he could get a lot of status and money? Or did he really believe it without paying attention to what's actually going on? Then there was Frederick Hayek, his student, who wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom, that said socialism will inevitably lead to totalitarianism. No American university wanted to hire him because they didn't agree with it, because they had this tradition of democratic socialism. Okay. So the rich paid his salary at the University of Chicago Committee on Social Thought. It's not a Department of Economics. And his position was sort of created just for him to have status and a voice and to get his stuff published. But he rejected the minimal government model. He rejected pure free enterprise. He said there's a need for social insurance and government regulation of hazards such as pollution and deforestation. This is long ago. But the rich didn't like his claim that government needed to be involved. So they created a 20-page summary of his view that did not include any of his discussion of government regulation or social insurance or anything. It only cut and pasted the parts that were anti-government. And so Hayek actually knew he was getting used, but it was kind of too late by then. They still got away with it. The free market project, okay? The rich set this up. It was like the New Testament, the Bible of capitalism. So then there was a guy named Milton Friedman who wrote a book, Capitalism and Freedom, in 1962, and it was just rich men's money that funded his book. So was he just an opportunist who just knew I can make a lot of money if I just tell rich people what they want to hear? Or did he really believe it? So I saw a little interview with him, and he said, well, of course you have to have public education because when people go to apply for a job, it has to have been a level field. They had to have gotten the same education. And so you're showing that one is either more motivated or more naturally talented. Well, as soon as people found out that the key is education, they created local real estate taxes as funding for schools. They created suburbs with wealthy houses that paid taxes to have public schools that were really well funded. I mean, the whole system geared toward creating housing, especially a whole society where some kids would get a better education than others, all in the name of a free market. And Milton Friedman should have known that. He's just either wicked, he just liked the popularity, or he's stupid. He's ignorant. He couldn't even understand that this is not going to work. And that he's only getting funded by rich people. Doesn't he want to consider what the intellectuals, the historians, people who've studied this material, what they think? Doesn't he even want to consider more than one side of the question? Um, Friedman said, in a capitalist society, anyone with money can freely promote his views. Wealthy people can support whatever ideas suit them, including outlier ones, and influence society. Yeah, they can. You don't have to tell me that. But what about everybody else? That's not really free speech if only the wealthy people get to promote their views. Only rich people can afford to hire people who will defend their view. So now the government or the laws protect the rich. So free speech is not free. It costs money to have your speech saturate the media conglomerates, right? The various media. The great threat to freedom is the concentration of power, all right? And then the rich say the concentration of power in government, that government must stay out of economic affairs, that unrestrained capitalism was the only system that could protect freedom. So, we do have people who think that. As far as I know, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel think that, Project 2025. And, it wasn't that long ago that the American public would say, no, we need the wealthy to pay more taxes. We need, the whole list from the last article. So what happened to that? By the 1960s, the reforms of the New Deal, the experiences of European social democracy, had proved that governments could both act assertively in marketplaces and strengthen social safety nets without undermining democratic governance. But by the end of the century, it was clear that the central premise of the myth was just plain wrong. And then there were a number of free market dictatorships. Okay. Then the next article is the New Deal. So Charles Grassley in 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talked about the Green New Deal, and she wants our government to invest heavily in green technology and to pay workers, just like the um, FDR New Deal, where you hired a lot of people. They could form unions, they could make demands for protections, all sorts of stuff. She wants a Green New Deal where the government funds projects, but they're green projects. So we can move into the green energy transition. We can start competing with the Chinese. Um, but Mr. Grassley says the New Deal didn't work. It didn't get us out of the Depression. The Depression didn't end until we entered World War II. Okay. And he argued against the proposal by saying that just like the original Green New Deal, it will dampen economic growth and hurt jobs. That is not true. So this historian is saying Grassley's wrong. So using the myth of the New Deal's failure to prevent or diminish effective policy responses to the economic and climate crises of the 21st century may turn out to be the most consequentially pernicious and indeed catastrophic of all in all of human history. Like, this is the worst myth because it's preventing us from going green and from stopping this huge bleeding of income inequality, of economic inequality in the US. People use a story about the past to justify what they do now. There are patterns in the way people use and abuse history. And, I've been talking about that a lot. People use and abuse John Locke. They use and abuse Kant. They use and abuse Descartes. They use and abuse Adam Smith. They use and abuse the utilitarians. And they use and abuse Karl Marx, right? You have to get straight that you've been listening probably to narratives that are not accurate about these issues. And they're leading you to think in a certain way, and you need to step back and rethink that. The US business cycles, what was it? The Depression occurred in 1929, right? There was a 30% decline. It was the worst in US history, and it was caused by Hubert Hoover's Republicans' minimal government, free market that led to the Great Depression. But from 1933, this is when FDR brought in the New Deal, business expansion was the direct result of the New Deal. You can prove it statistically. It was the highest growth in the economy in US history, except from wartime, before World War II, gearing up for World War II. But it was a huge, 33 to 37 was a huge recovery of the economy caused by the New Deal. What were the benefits? Well, you prevented Americans from starving, getting sick. It rescued the banks and the currency. It brought electricity to people who've never had it. So the Inflation Reduction bill and the Build Back Better, among other things it does, is to provide internet to people who hadn't had it. So, it's very similar. It's a different era. So there's a different kind of energy source. Again, the green energy transition is going to lead to we need a new grid, or we need a new, totally different new kind of infrastructure to supply green energy. They built a national road network, right? So the railroads are owned by the government. They controlled flooding. They eradicated diseases. The government did this, all right? The government built levees and dams and other things to prevent flooding, because the private sector, it doesn't pay. You don't make money building a dam. It established the right to join a union. to secure an old age pension and to obtain unemployment insurance, to earn a minimum wage, and to protect you from hazards. Okay, these are other things that socialism did. Hoover broke down the enterprise and initiative of the American people, the negation of the ideals upon which our civilization has been based. So his minimal government, just keep giving the rich more money, it demotivated people, right? People are more motivated when they have more opportunity, when they have a job, when they have their houses aren't going to flood, they aren't going to get diseases, they can join a union. You know, you have to give people reasons to work hard and have initiative. They don't have a initiative to work hard for a rich person that's never going to give them a decent job or an opportunity to move up. So overall, there's plenty of exceptions, but overall, that corporate control in before 1929 was not motivating people. We didn't have a robust economy, um, and especially not a democratic economy. So the way the data gets distorted, the older charts don't count the New Deal workers as working, which is ridiculous. But the WPA, not only did they work, they unionized, they went on strike, they were paid a decent wage. The government couldn't discriminate based on race. They did useful work like roads, which helped with the post-war sub, uh, suburbanization boom, right? So, a chart that does not include these government workers as workers is just biased. How to lie with statistics, how data gets distorted. These older data are free, but the newer data that realize, wait a sec, you didn't include the WPA workers, then you have to pay for that. And all of this is deliberate. So your opinions are distorted deliberately. So what about the New Deal? The government spent about 10% of the GDP. During World War II, the government spent 40%. So the natural conclusion is that the New Deal should have been even bigger to get us out of the Depression. Roosevelt wanted more spending, but cut it because of political pressure. So when he cut the spending, there was a 1-year recession. So from 33 to 37, he spent 10% and the economy grew. Then he cut it, and then there was a 1-year recession. And then World War II started another boom. And so Grassley will say, oh, you see, the New Deal didn't work. It wasn't until the war that the economy recovered. That's not true. The New Deal, and it wasn't just jobs, but they gave jobs for all Americans that all Americans benefited from, services that all Americans can use, roads. So Roosevelt campaigned on social justice. He showed the interdependence of all Americans and all people. He wanted a permanent readjustment of our social and economic arrangements. The New Deal saved democracy because you don't have a lot of desperate people. And Americans have rights that are not in the Constitution, is what he said. The right to a decent job, a decent standard of living, housing, medical care, education, protection when injured or aged. And he won 4 elections by saying that, right? Well, nowadays, do you think we have those rights? Yeah. So this lecture is just the overall point is that you would think about the New Deal. What is this? Oh dear. How come that isn't? Oh, You would think about the Enlightenment. You would think about the language you heard from the Enlightenment. You would think about whether you have a worldview based on an Enlightenment thinker, and you think about whether you're applying that in ways today that was not intended by those original thinkers. You think about how those ideas have been applied, misapplied, or what, for in the interests of the people who use those words because they're powerful words. They're part of the American myth, these words, who we are and who we're not. We're not socialists, or we're the myth of the marketplace, or we're capitalists, or whatever. Whatever it is, just rethink and rethink the whole tradition before now, and then rethink what we have to do now that we're in this fourth industrial revolution. When the third industrial revolution, we've already talked about that during the Enlightenment. Again, they had waves during the Enlightenment. They had the minimal government, then you had utilitarianism, then you had Marxism, although that was Russia and China. That really wasn't the industrialized world that had these revolutions. So it was the industrialized world that sort of self-corrected by having socialism. That wasn't a dirty word until the Marxist revolutions. All right, so I hope you can wrestle with those themes and think for yourself about re-examining your assumptions and where you want to go from here, or what sort of questions you want to keep an open mind about from now on, because you had assumed one point of view and now you have reasons to want to reject it or to want to expand it. That's what I would like you to consider.